So hello everybody and welcome to today's Leading Edge Forum webinar, The Ways and Means of Industrialization. My name is Dave Reid. I'm the Research Programme Director here at the Leading Edge Forum and I'm joined by my colleague Simon Wardley, who I'll introduce shortly to take through the bulk of the content today. For those of you that don't know us, Leading Edge Forum is a research and advisory group. We really specialise in helping business executives get more value from technology-enabled change, and we do that through a portfolio of research projects, workshops, and advisory events. So to set some context around today's session, I'm going to very quickly whiz you back to 2011 when we published a paper called Learnings from Web 2.0, in which Simon examined and explained the characteristics of next generation organizations versus their more traditional rivals in terms of how they leveraged technology. Fast forward to 2015 and a subsequent paper called Of Wonders and Disruptions looked at how specific technology groups or technology sets were evolving. And by examining weak signals, we were able to predict phases of peace, war, and wonder as those specific technology sets evolved. So if I bring us then to today, and we hope that in this post-pandemic world that we will, I hope, soon find ourselves in, technology evolution and competition will of course continue. So if we take the characteristics and we take the technology sets and then add in the industry lens, we'll hopefully start to build a fairly compelling and interesting picture around how organizations should be leveraging this industrialization of technology for their benefit. So today really marks also the start of a research project for us as well. So there'll be some details during the webinar around how you could potentially participate and assist Simon and I with that work. So without further ado, I'm just going to hand over to Simon. Just before I do, we'll be running some Q&A throughout the session. So if you'd like to pose a question for Simon, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and we'll put those questions to Simon at the correct moment. So without further ado, Simon, and for those of you that know kind of Simon's work, you can expect some maps, I suspect, and maybe a cat or two thrown in for good measure.
Of
so Simon,
course,
why don't you get us started?
Thank you very much. Okay, so the ways and means of industrialization. We've got about half an hour to go through the subject, and then we're going to do some Q&A. I'm going to start off with a very quick introduction into maps. And then we'll talk about the concept of industrialization itself. Then we'll talk about impact. After that, we'll talk about the research. And finally, we'll talk about what's next. Okay, so quickly, introduction into maps. All maps are imperfect representations of a space. So this is a map of France. It's not a perfect map of France. Doesn't mean it's not useful. In order to be a perfect map of France, it would have to be one-to-one scale, which means it would be the size of France. It would therefore be France itself. And as a map, that's not very useful. So maps are always imperfect representations of a space. Sorry, I just jumped forward a slide. When we talk about usefulness, the reason why it's useful, it goes back to the old strategy cycle. So you've basically got your purpose, the game that you are playing. The next thing you need to observe is the landscape you're operating in. So that's what we use maps for. And by creating a visual representation of a landscape, we learn what are called climatic patterns. So how that landscape is changing. And that stuff is useful for anticipation. And most of what we're going to be doing in this session is all about that anticipation. Once you get beyond that, you get into the interesting area of doctrine and organizational structure. And this is where we get into things like pioneers, settlers, town planners. And then beyond that, you get into the whole leadership. So where do I attack? How do I manipulate the space to my favor? Now, there's hundreds of patterns in that space, but we're going to mainly focus on this session on landscape and those climatic patterns, because that's what industrialization is about. It's about anticipating a set of changes. Now, other thing about maps I have to mention is these are maps, not graphs. Almost everything we have in business is unfortunately a graph. And just to explain the difference, the three images at the top are all graphs. Nottingham, London, Dover, Nottingham, London, Dover, Nottingham, London, Dover. They're all identical, same connections, M1, M2. Now, the three images at the bottom are all different. They are maps. And the difference between a map and a graph is simply that in a map, space has meaning. So with a graph, if you move a piece in a way, like you take a mind map and you move something left or right, it doesn't change the context. But in a map, it does. So if you take a map of the world and shift, I don't know, Australia and put it next to the UK, obviously it changes the context and the meaning. Now, in order to map business, we have to have the same characteristics that we have in geographical maps. And those basic characteristics can be boiled down into have an anchor, so magnetic north, or in the case of the maps that we do, you could have customers, the business, regulators, but you have to have an anchor. Then you have to have position relative to an anchor. So in geographical maps, this is north, south, east, or west of this point. In terms of when mapping out competitive landscape, we look at position in terms of the value chain. And lastly, you need to have a way of representing movement. So heading north means we're heading north. There's consistency. We do this with our form of maps by looking at evolution. So we have the same characteristics, anchor, position, and movement that you do have in a geographical map. And that way, space actually has meaning in our maps. If I move any of these pieces on the map in front of you, it changes the context. Anyway, this is not session which is going to go through an introduction into how to map. There's some wonderful tools online. There's in fact an entire mapping community. I mean, the LEF has its own tools. There's a course online, learn.leadingedgeforum.com, which was put together by Chris Daniels. It'll take a few weeks. A great little course to learn. And of course, all of this stuff is Creative Commons. So if you just go to medium.com, Wardley Maps, you can read about it all there. There's about 19 chapters with a basic introduction. So if you're looking for that, start at those two places. Anyway, what I want to get onto is the concept of industrialization. Now, Dave Reid mentioned that we looked back in 2011, 2012, at traditional versus next generation companies. Now, this is the table that I actually developed in 2011, published in 2012. And what we discovered is that traditional companies had certain properties which were very different from this next generation. But they also had things which were the same. So for example, traditional, their structure was departmental, whereas this next generation of organization, which was much more service cell-based. Culture was seen as a point of inertia in traditional organizations, whereas the next generation were much more fluid, more gameable. Corporate focus was more on profit in traditional, but it was about disruption in the next generation. Open source was about cost reduction, where it was seen as a weapon in terms of the next generation. And learning, very much analyst in the traditional sense, and very much ecosystem based in the next generation. And it just continued on. So big data used, driven by, and then a whole bunch of things which we bundled together and called the DevOps movement. So very much next generation was all about design for failure, chaos engine, scale out, and continuous deployment. Now, the question is, how do we come up with this table? Because remember, this was 2011. And I know Andy and Patrick came up with the term DevOps in 2008, 2009. And cloud had been going on for about 5 years. But how did we identify, how could we be so sure about these characteristics? And over time, so this is nine getting on for 10 years later, a lot of those next generation sort of characteristics have become important. So how do we do this? Well, to explain that, I'm going to have to go right back to basics, and then we'll build up to how we get to industrialization, and then we'll look at how we exploited that. So when we talk about capital on maps, all the forms of capital, whether it's physical things or activities, are evolving. And they evolve from genesis to more commodity, but they don't do so in one step. they go through many, many steps. So if you take, for example, compute, we started in 1943, the Z3, end up 2006, utility provision by Amazon. And I just put an imaginary 7 steps in there for you. In fact, there are hundreds. Now, every one of those steps, every product has its own diffusion curve. And so in the same way with biological systems, you get diffusion of biological systems like a virus. Through multiple waves of diffusion, you also get the evolution. And so the same thing happens in competitive systems within business. Now, your single component is part of an entire value chain. So we start from the perspective of the user. A user needs an application, some coding practice, runtime, operating system, some architectural practice, and at the bottom is that computers and infrastructure. And that is evolving. And the most interesting changes that we find, and one of the patterns, those climactic patterns we found, is that when we shift from product to more commodity, what happens is when the thing goes from product to more commodity, we see an explosion of higher order systems, new sources of value created, new emerging practices, the efficiency with which we can deliver something is improved, and the speed at which we can operate is improved. So something like electricity enables things like radio, television, lighting. In the same way with cloud, it caused an explosion of new things to appear. Now, this is perfectly normal, by the way, very, very common. If you go back through history, all of these sort of major ages that we'd like to talk about, the agricultural revolution, the industrial revolution, the age of steam and transport, are all caused by points of industrialization. So particular types of technology shifting from the sort of product space to more commodity. So take something as simple as electricity. It's not that Tesla and Westinghouse discovered electricity. That started with the Parthian battery a long, long time before. And we had products like things like Siemens generators. What happened was it transitioned from being a product-based industry to much more of a commodity utility-based industry. That is what caused the explosion of new things and the change of practices. Okay, but it's not only the good stuff that happens. We also have resistance to this change. And that resistance comes from our pre-existing capital and past success, and also our existing practices. So the thing, whatever it is, compute electricity changes, its characteristics changes. We get this a new emerging practice, but we get resistance from the past practice and the past investment. But on top of this, we also get capital flows. So money that was invested in these past practices and past way of operating move out to the more utility providers and also to the new things being built on top. And this is a perfectly normal process as well. We call this creative destruction by Joseph Schumpeter. Fundamental impulse that keeps the capitalist engine in motion is all the new stuff that appears, but it also requires destruction of that past. So, you know, we're stuck behind these inertia barriers, the new thing appears, it creates this, the more industrialized thing appears, it creates these new things as well as these new practices, and of course all the past stuck behind inertia barriers eventually goes off the cliff. All perfectly normal. Okay, so that's the basic pattern. We have a value chain, a component evolves from product to more commodity, causes new practices, new things to appear. We see movements of capital, we see inertia. But in order for this to trigger, you need a number of factors in place. You need concept, suitability, technology, and attitude. So something like cloud, you needed the concept of utility provision of compute. You needed to be suitable, widespread, well-defined enough. You needed the technology to exist, things like Zen, and you needed attitude, i.e. you needed people to be dissatisfied with the current way of working and operating. And often that can appear not just through market competition, but because of some forcing function, some forcing need, which changes the way we operate. So if I go all the way back to New York City, I mean, we talk about the automotive industry and how we rapidly changed. We moved from horses to basically automotives. In the period of about 10, 15 years, a massive transformation. The problem beforehand was poop. New York used to have these these public committees set up to deal with the mountains of horse manure that the city was suffering from. So often there's some sort of forcing need, something occurs which helps drive that process of industrialization. Okay, so that's the basic pattern. Things move from product to more commodity, creates a change of practice, explosion of new needs. We see capital flows move out of those areas. We have inertia because of past success, existing practice, which slows us down. And there's often some sort of forcing need, which actually really kicks this whole process off. Okay, now we gave that particular pattern, we gave it a name. We called it the Peace, War and Wonder cycle. It's actually what I called it back in the canonical days. So we start off with the wonder of the novel and new, and then that thing evolves and we get this sort of peaceful state of competition where companies build up and in competition with each other, and they're all building inertia to this change. And then it's normally some new entrant, not encumbered by a pre-existing business model. So something like cloud, it was a bookseller, comes in and kicks off the state of war, and that causes all of these changes to occur. And that goes all the way through the stack. So recently we wrote a report on serverless, and it's exactly the same pattern occurring. We've got a shift of the runtime from product to utility with people with systems like Lambda. We've got emerging coding practice, novel and new things being created on top. We've got inertia because of existing practices, existing ways of operating. So perfectly normal. So this leads me then to impact. So if we know this basic pattern, how can we exploit this? Well, back in 2011, we knew of this pattern. I'd used it previously at Canonical when fighting Red Hat and Microsoft in our move to the cloud. So we knew it was going on. So we had this cloud war, we knew the shift, it was 2011, it's 5 years after the shift had started. We knew there'd be an emerging practice. We just didn't know quite what that emerging practice would be. So we had to go and do some observation. And so we interviewed huge numbers of companies and we looked at 50 basically candidate properties or changes of behavior, most of which didn't change at all. So for example, when we separated companies into traditional next generation, if you ask them, do you open source things which you consider a source of advantage, the answer was always no. They were identical in so many ways. Collaboration, innovation, most things, they were identical. But there were certain characteristics which they were radically different across, literally we had two different populations. So for example, our company deploys open as a way of manipulating a market to our favor. The traditional companies were like, strongly disagree, we never do that sort of thing. Whereas the next generation companies were like, yes, we use that all the time. And it turned out of those list of 50 characteristics, these were the ones that were fundamentally different in terms of the way companies operated, which is where that table came from. So we had used our maps and our understanding of economic patterns to anticipate that there would be a change in terms of the characteristics of organizations. So then we actually did a piece of research to basically a population study on companies to identify whether this was real or not. And certainly for these characteristics, a new population of companies appeared. And this is perfectly normal. If we go back through time, what we discover is every time we have one of these major ages, which is driven by the industrialization of some technology, you also get new organizational forms. agricultural, we got the commercial farmer and markets, industrial revolution, we got things like the American system of engineering and time management, age of steam and transport, joint stock company, and so forth. So every time we go through one of these ways of industrialization, new forms of organization appear. Okay. So that brings us then a bit more up to date to the research and where we're going to be going with this stuff. Now, one of the things about the maps is we have this pattern. So we know things industrialize. We know it enables the appearance of higher order systems and new practices. We know there can be forcing functions. We know we have inertia. But the line at the bottom, the Genesis custom built product commodity, that axis actually comes from this piece of work, which was I published back in 2005, 2006. And this describes how capital evolves, driven by demand and supply competition. So what happens on a scale of ubiquity versus certainty? So how widespread and how well understood something is, roughly speaking. We start off with the genesis of the novel new, custom-built product and commodity. Now this was derived from this, publication types. So what happens is in our industry, publications normally talk about the wonder of something, the wonder of radio. And then we get on to building construction awareness, so how to build your own crystal radio set. Then we get on to operation, maintenance, feature differentiation. So my radio is better or worse than yours. And finally, we get on to use. So we stop worrying about radio, it's just what's on the radio. And using stage 3 and 4, we can create a weak signal for when industrialization is likely to occur. And that's what we did back in 2014, is we looked at a range of different points of technology and looked at when was it likely that we would see industrialization in that space based upon the publication types. Now, as I said, maps are imperfect. This is very imperfect approach. These are approximations. But what you've got within this 10-year period from 2020 to 2030 is we're likely to see industrialization in areas such as robotics, and sensor as a service, and immersive technology, and 3D printing, and even down to the field of genetic engineering. And of course, all those industrialization, that shift from product to commodity, will change practices, and that's going to impact in terms of the speed at which we can build things, and it's also going to enable novel and new things to appear. Which is why on the study tour, we deliberately chose companies this year which were focused on that area of industrialization. Companies like 6 Sense, which is focused on the industrialization of robotics use in healthcare. Companies like Makerbot, focused on 3D printing and basically putting 3D printing everywhere. We had companies focused on space and industrialization of space, as well as sensor technology. So this is BrainCo. This is a very interesting group where they basically have sensors for making sure that children are actually concentrating on what they should be doing. And so obviously if you are concentrating, it's either, it's yellow, it's good. And if you're messing around, it's red. Now there are big social implications of this, but the point is sensors have become so widespread and so well defined, so much of a commodity. There's all sorts of new practices and new things we can use them for. Now, some of these, obviously the 3D printing, we've got the mask, because what's happened recently is we've had that forcing function. So we've had basically the isolation economy appear because of things like, because of COVID. And so that potentially will drive a faster rate of industrialization. So there are many things that we've talked about doing, but for reasons of inertia, we haven't done. But there has now been that attitude change. We need to isolate, we need to be separated, and so that'll create pressure for further industrialization, which itself will have knock-on effects. And of course, all of this stuff, and going back to the original sort of idea of maps, is all context specific. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, let's take retail. So something in retail, a user needs to go and do their shopping. There is an entire value chain around that space. And one of the mechanisms will be, one of the paths within that value chain will be delivery. So what's happened with the isolation economy is, we may have talked about doing drone delivery in the past, but there was always a bit of resistance to that sort of automated idea. But because of this separation needed, it creates pressure for that to actually occur. So we might see more industrialization of drone technology, which will allow for emerging practices, the use of swarms, etc., of drones, and that potentially will have knock-on effects in creating new needs. In the same way that improving network communication and enabled us with mobile phones, enabled entire new needs, things like Uber, to appear. Now, that's within retail. The same pressures impacting that can impact other industries. So I'm just going to switch just for a second. I have to jump onto my computer here. Hang on a second. Let's stop sharing this. What I'm going to do is I'm going to share a whiteboard. Hopefully you can all see that. So I've drawn two lines in here. Let me just let's make sure that's connected. Right. My handwriting is unfortunately pretty terrible at the best of times. I'm just going to go Genesis down here. I'm going to just put custom down here, product down here, and commodity. And I promise over time I will get better doing this sort of stuff. I'm going to take a totally different industry. In fact, I'm not going to take an industry. Let's go for something completely different. Let's go for something in defense. So let's look at something like terrorists. Right. But terrorists have various needs, their political agenda, whatever it happens to be. One of those is obviously, unfortunately, to create terror. And that requires a number of things. You need a payload. And secondly, you need a delivery mechanism. Well, we've just talked about delivery in retail. So unfortunately, what we've got is the potential, we're talking drones are now shifting over to more of a utility. So we can get rid of that line. Let's put this in here. That's right, drones in here. We're going to create a new emerging practices. We talked about potential for swarms and all this sort of stuff for delivery. And of course, this stuff here is being driven by a different need, which is isolation. Okay. So the point about this is industrialization can impact multiple different industries, and sometimes needs which create completely desirable, beneficial changes in one space can have pretty negative impacts in other spaces, which from a point of view of defense, we now have to counteract this sort of force. So let me go back. I mean, that's a very simplistic example, but it's just purely just to explain the point that industrialization of one space can impact other spaces. So what's next? What do we have to do? So this is what the research project is about. We have multiple points of industrialization heading towards us. We have multiple different contexts that we have to consider, and we also have forcing functions in place. So we picked 5 tech examples based upon weak signals. So robotics, immersion, space, manufacturing, and sensors. And all of those, we're going to need to create tech working groups to look at, and these are going to be virtual working groups we're going to set up to look at those emerging practices that are likely to occur. We're also going to need to do 5 industry working groups: healthcare, defense, government, banking, automotive. Now, those are going to need to map out the value chains within those industries, and also take those emerging practices and the likely points of industrialization and see what the impact is on their particular industry. we're also going to need one working group which is going to have to look at forcing functions. So things like, for example, the isolation economy, or maybe cross-industry pollution, as in this will impact not only this industry, but as a result of industrialization here, it's going to have maybe defense concerns. Then we're going to have to amalgamate all those different working groups together to come up with our table for our traditional and next generation, i.e. the next generation. This was from 2011. We need our 2021 version, which is going to last us the next decade. So, summarize, we're going to go and do a bit of basically forecasting, looking into the crystal ball, but we're going to do it with a bit of mapping. And fortunately, you know, we've had a history of doing this pretty successfully. So well, we'll see what happens. But this time we're going to invite people from outside. We're going to need those 11 working groups set up. So I'm going to, at this point, just say thank you very much. Those who want to get involved, this is my email address, simon.wardley@Leading Edge Forum. Also, Dave is going to be working with me on this as well. So that's Dave's email address, or you can find us on Twitter. If you want to be involved in any of those working groups, because we're going to get them set up pretty quickly, do shout out. Tell us which one. Do you want to be in a tech group? Do you want to be in an industry group or the general needs group? And we will involve you in this project. And at that point, I'm going to hand over to Dave and say thank you.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you very much indeed. And there's been a number of questions come in, Simon. So we'll shift into Q&A mode. And folks, if we don't get to your question, I apologise. There's a lot of people on the call today. So we will do our best to get back to you afterwards via Twitter or some other mechanism. But I'll kick off, Simon, just making this question here. What would you predict is the next evolution beyond disruption, other than perhaps more disruption?
So what happens if I'm going to switch back? I'm afraid, everybody. I'm going to unfortunately do this stuff live. I'm going to go back to a whiteboard because I have to use whiteboards. Screen share whiteboard. Right. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to erase everything. Give me a second. I've only just got this thing. It's fantastic, actually. But there you go. I've had my own inertia to change. Right, let's just draw 2 lines. Actually, I don't tend to use the value chain. The value chain is a line I put up there for people who are beginning, basically, so they just get used to the idea of mapping. The value chain is actually within the chain of needs. So what happens when we talk about Genesis, custom built, product, commodity? When we talk about disruption, something evolves, and what often happens is we will get a substitution within a phase. So one product will get disrupted by another product, will get disrupted by another product. Most of the time, though, it's not disruptive. And when it is, it's highly unpredictable. One of the interesting things is when we shift from product to more commodity, this form of disruption, the inertia, how the past industries are stuck behind those inertia barriers, how we see the capital flow, explosion of new things, is highly predictable. We can anticipate not only what's going to happen, but also the impact. But unfortunately, because people don't understand context or don't think about mapping, they use one word, disruption, to mean both things, the highly unpredictable product substitution and the highly predictable product to utility substitution. So we get these wonderful debates where people, unfortunately Christensen's passed away, but used to be Christensen and Lepore arguing about how disruption was predictable and non-predictable, and the answer is they're both right. It's just one aspect is, well, there's one type which is and one type that isn't, and you only get to see this if you actually map out the space. So what happens is things evolve, and then we generate higher order systems which evolve, which generate higher order systems which evolve, and the things lower down tend to just become less visible over time. So we are constantly moving up the stack. Now the question here is also one of speed. Are we accelerating in terms of the speed at which disruptions occur? Well, certainly at the bottom, if we take nuts and bolts, that took about 2,000 years. If we take electricity, it was 1,800 years. If we take something like computing, it was about 60 years. So at the moment, what we're seeing is generally to go from Genesis to the point of industrialization is 30 to 50 years, roughly. There's some evidence to say 20 to 30, but and then it takes 10 to 15 years to wipe out the previous industries or become the new norm, basically. But unfortunately, that's fast enough that we see multiple waves of industrialization hitting us at the same time. So we see, robotics and computing and a whole bunch of things all coming at us at the same time. And because of that, we sort of ignore the tail, the 30 to 50 years to get to that point. So we forget that VR started in the 1960s, or 3D printing was 1968. All we see is it's happening right now. So we think it's even faster. So the answer to your question is yes, we're going to see more disruption as we move up the stack, because the novel and new things will over time become industrialized, unless we learn to play these games a bit better, which means people have to start to understand their context more. And of course, we're going to see more and more waves coming at us over time, simply because we've gone from 2,000 years to industrialize the space to 30 to 50.
Simon.
Pleasure. Any other questions?
Yeah, there's many more than we'll be able to get to in the time available, but I'll try and roll some of them up. So okay. Can you explain more around how human values and leadership competencies can be incorporated to the model? And there is a related question which asks around, when you're building, delivering an evolving business, you require competencies and resources with necessary capabilities and skills. So how would you develop a roadmap for skills for the future?
Right.
Is that another map?
No, totally understand. So if we go back to the strategy cycle where I talked about observing the landscape and climatic patterns, there's about 30 common climatic patterns, of which this peace, war, and wonder cycle is one, which we use for anticipation. Now, when we get into orientation, there's about 40 principles or doctrine that we call them for how you orientate yourself around change. And now most organizations are pretty poor at this sort of doctrine. So do you understand your users? Do you understand your user needs? How do you remove bias and duplication? Use of multiple methods when tackling a problem. There's a nice long list of about 40, all the way down to sort of structures like pioneers, settlers, town planners. So how do you build a structure which copes with constant change? Now that's not part of this topic. There's more of that online. But what you can do with maps is when you map out a space, I mean, we often use them for things like pre-mortems, post-mortems, and then we also use maps for looking between different systems to getting rid of duplication, etc. And then we also use maps because we can now anticipate change. We can see the types of people that we actually require and the skills that we require. So if I go back to this one here, let's just get rid of this just here. Right, let's say I've got some sort of map I built. There's so many of different types, and I'm just going to put some random dots. Let's say it looks like something like this. All right, and I happen to know that these points are going to, over time, they're going to, with supply and demand competition, evolve. So this gives me an idea. I can use this to anticipate that this is going to change. I can use the weak signals, when the components are there, to realize I'm going to need skill sets in this particular space. So that it's going to enable higher order systems to appear. So I might need skill sets over here as well for developing new needs. So by using that combination of maps and anticipation, I can use it to identify the sort of skill sets and also the type of people. This is, going well out of the subject here. This is where we get into this whole structure of pioneers, settlers, and town planners. So what we have is you need certain types of attitude, whether it's finance, whether it's HR, whether it's marketing, whether it's IT or any form of engineering. There's a certain type of attitude needed to operate in this space, which we call pioneers. There's a certain type of attitude need to operate in this space, which we call settlers. And there's a certain type of attitude needed to operate in this space, which we call town planners. Now, in order to have a company cope with constant change, what you need to do is you need to have a system whereby new things appear and they are stolen by the next group and evolved into more product, and then stolen by the next group and evolved into more industrialized. And this is the concept of pioneer settlers, town planners. Now, there's a wonderful paper by GCHQ, which is our intelligence services, called Boiling Frogs. It's totally online. Well recommend reading it. You'll find more posts on it, but this is quite a bit outside the subject of industrialization. But yes, you can use mapping for those sorts of HR activities.
Thanks, Simon.
Pleasure.
A couple of questions of the moment around the impact of COVID-19. So,
Sure.
do you see any impact for Wardley mapping techniques and practices? Will this pandemic change anything for Wardley maps?
Oh, okay.
And I think in a related, a COVID-related question, which I've momentarily mislaid. How will the current crisis have effects? Will the current crisis have long-term effects, or will everything go back up to normal after a while? So just your thoughts on that.
So that's one of the things we've got to look at in terms of this particular needs group. We're talking about mapping physical capital here. There's a way of mapping culture and mapping ethical values, and so there's a number of different knock-on effects. And one of them, one of the big questions is, once we get this industrialization, will it go back? Or will there be fundamental questions and differences to the way we operate, even to the point of, those fundamental questions of me versus we in culture itself? So that's one of the things we've got to look at, a particular viewpoint, but we obviously want to get working group and get some outside input into this to help us refine those ideas. So yes, there is an issue in terms of we like to think we will just go back to our normal way of operating. But, once you have that forcing function to change that attitude and we get used to these industrialized forms and these emerging practices appear, then it's often very difficult for us to go back. The second question was the impact on Wardley mapping itself. It's an interesting one because I do actually have a map of mapping, which starts from the need of mapping and all the different components. I certainly know that mapping is being used in all sorts of interesting places, from the United Nations. It's being taught at different universities, all the way down to venture capital firms, and so it's diffusing and spreading itself. But these sorts of changes normally take 30 to 50 years. For mapping itself to become industrialized is no different from other technology changes. And so it's only been 15 years down that journey. So it's possible, but I've certainly seen it being used in discrete examples of people dealing with problems related to things around COVID. But will it itself accelerate the process? I doubt it, but I could be wrong, and that's certainly something we should investigate as part of that needs group.
Yeah, and I would just add as well, I think I've spoken to a number of clients certainly who've been looking at using mapping to apply to their sourcing strategies right now, given the crisis being of the moment. Take a map and look at your portfolio is something I'm seeing a number of people doing.
Well, one of the interesting things in that space is obviously most organizations have very poor understanding of their supply chains beyond one up, one down. We often know who we buy from and who we sell to. And that's it. And that can really impact, has impacts in all sorts of different areas, including nation state competition and regulation. So one of the things we did with mapping was we looked at China and we deep dive into the way that China gameplayed the system. That was back in 2014, 2015, roughly, and came up with that report, which was not popular with some people, which was basically saying that China would dominate all these different spaces based upon the games that they played. But most organizations have had really poor understanding. So you know, maybe this is a forcing function there.
Grand. Just again, more than we'll be able to get to today, but I'll just try and get a variety and we'll go back afterwards. How many data points did you use to predict war for the various areas such as robotics? Is there a threshold value for the number of data points to have a fair confidence in the anticipation?
Oh, blimey. So the original graph had over 9,000 data points in terms of that was creating that whole evolution axis. And in terms of, you know, we're talking weak signals. So it's looking at publication types. So again, going back to 2014, I can't remember off the top of my head. It's will be hundreds, if not thousands. But how confident does that make us? It's this is not a crystal ball. This is not a, we know that things will industrialize over time. All this is a weak signal. So it's just implying to us that this stuff is based on the analysis that we did is likely to industrialize. Doesn't mean it will. It may be during this process we go, well, actually, no, it's going to take longer. It's just really more of a pointer for something to look at. So there is no, unfortunately, there is no way of getting through the uncertainty barrier, the information barrier that is the future. There is no crystal ball. All we can do is reduce the number of possible options to come up with basically what we think are likely scenarios. That's the best we can do.
And I think from my own work, some of the uncertainty around timing makes some of your investment decisions more of a leap of faith than something that's more informed. And actually a related question on that, timing decisions regarding investment can be critical given the time non-linearities of adoption and forcing function effects. How can a business better predict when shifts will happen?
Right. So one of the big things about maps is you will notice there is no time on maps. And there is no time on maps because in order to see the pattern of evolution, I had to abolish the concept of time. If you try and do it over time, you will never get anywhere. So what we have is a system whereby time is actually measured by change in maps. So you have one map and you have the same map a bit later and things have moved. And that is the passage of time. You can't go and say, you know, in 2 days this will be there. Doesn't work like that. Now, one of the beauties about maps is that we can put all our assumptions down on a way that we can challenge each other. So I've got assumptions about what's going to happen, and I can put it in a mapping form and you can see my assumptions and we can have the debate and argument over the map. Now, normally in business, what happens is we don't have maps. So I have my assumptions and it's in story form. And if I give you story form and you challenge the story, you're actually personally attacking me and challenging me, because we tell everybody in business that the key is to be a good storyteller. Therefore, if you are challenging my story, you are challenging me. And so it always boils down to high-paid person's opinion, etc. One of the beauties about getting these assumptions in a mapping form, we get rid of that politics, not completely, but a big chunk, and we can actually discuss about the changing environment. What it doesn't do, it doesn't provide us a way of accurately predicting the future. I'm afraid that's just purely impossible.
Sure. So I'm going to shift just a couple of questions coming in around sort of specifics around some technologies and some specifics around the industry selections as well. Would you consider voice first to be in the list of categories of weak signal analysis?
So here's one of the things. There are so many potential areas we could look at. I just chose based upon what I think were the strongest signals and had the biggest sort of impact. So that's where I came up with that list technology area, things like robotics, immersion, manufacturing space. That's where that came from. So it may be that within one of those groups, somebody wants to look into the whole issue of voice. I mean, I have my own personal interest in this. One of the practices that became clear in the serverless report is as we shift the runtime from product to utility, we get all these new practices about capital flow, but we've also got things like conversational programming starting to appear. And it's very, very early stages at the moment, but that's this wonderful world of, basically I'm talking to a system and I'm talking to something which is building the system for me. So voice is an interesting one. Maybe as part of the immersion group, they might look into that.
Yeah, just a good point, actually, Simon. Someone's asked the question. Can you just briefly explain what you mean by immersive tech?
So immersive tech is that whole area of augmented reality to virtual reality, where the technology is it is not something just discrete. It's ubiquitous. It's a part. It surrounds us completely. So we're more immersed is the best word unfortunately I can think of in the technology itself.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. The 5 tech working groups don't seem to be that relevant to banking. Should they be?
Well, that's the banking was one of the industries that we wanted to have a look at. I mean, in terms of robotics, immersion, sensors, it may be. I don't know. We'll see what the practices come out of the technology groups, and we'll see what the banking working group come up with. I mean, it's a useful exercise anyway to try and map out part of the banking value chain. I was one of the judges for the UK's open banking competition, so it's always a sort of fascinating space. Will this technology impact them? Potentially.
Yeah.
But I'm not going to try and preempt what a working group's going to come up with.
No, indeed. And I think, yeah, just one of the things that we've got a lot of questions around the working groups. So maybe respectful of everyone's time, let's just finish up with just a couple of questions on the working groups, the mechanics, how they're going to work.
Yeah.
Do you, well, I think let's start there. One of my jobs here, folks, is scope. So clearly there's only a number of things that we can go look at here. But how are the working groups going to function, Simon? How often? What is the expected output going to be?
Right. So the first thing we're looking for is volunteers. So if you're interested in being involved in either a technology or industry working group or the general need ones, get in contact, shout out, because we just need a list of names. And then what we're going to do is basically create a bunch of virtual meetings. So it'll be Zoom meetings. It'll be hopefully once a month. Each of those groups will independently meet up and people will swap around, change groups. And if we need to increase the tempo, etc., we can do so. So it'll be a couple of hours every month. So we're trying to keep it as light as possible. Now, what we need out of the technology groups is they need to look at the emerging practice. And that's a really tough thing, because if you take something like computing, when computing shifting from product to more of a utility, if you ask people in the space who are very, if you go back to 2009, 2010, 2011, a lot of people in the industry would talk about best practices for use of computers as a product, around data centers, around virtualization, etc. And so if you ask people in the industry about cloud, a lot of people were very, very dismissive about cloud. We had consultants writing wonderful papers on clearing the air on cloud and how it was all for startups, etc. So one of the problems that you have is experts in the industry often have inertia to the change itself. So what we have to do is identify those patterns which sometimes Industry experts will be very dismissive of, oh, it's not going to happen, it's not going to spread, etc. But it has whatever characteristics are needed to spread. Now, in the working groups on industry, we need to create value chains for those industries, and mostly they don't exist. So we need people who are experts in those industries to sit down and talk to each other and say, basically, starting from who are the core users, what are their needs, that could be business, government, regulators, what are the components involved, what does the actual value chain look like? And that can be quite a complicated process. And then, of course, what we need to do is then start to take those patterns, those practices emerging from the technology group and say, does this impact our space at all? And then, of course, with the needs group, we have to do the same, but we have to do it from a societal level. So we need to think about the forcing functions, so like the isolation economy. What sort of things is that going to impact? And also, what sort of cross-industry pollution might there be? So that's what we're looking for. People in those 3 different areas, 5 working groups on technology, 5 working groups on industry, 1 working group on general needs. And in terms of the amount of effort, we're trying to keep it light. So we're talking a Zoom call every month, hopefully for a few hours, and really up to the working group. Who wants to do more than that, we can accommodate that.
Sure. All right, Simon, thank you. Would you mind just popping the email address contacts back on the screen, just so that
Sure,
as we finish up, people can see those. That's how to get in touch with us. Simon.Wardley@leadingedgeforum.com, David.Reid@leadingedgeforum.com, or the Twitter handles you see below. Just want to thank everybody for joining us today. It's been a pleasure. Thank you, Simon, and thank you for the wonderful array of telephones and guitars on display in the background, which have been commented on in the chat. So I hope everybody stays safe and well, and we'll look forward to seeing you again soon.
Pleasure.
Bye, everyone.
Okay.